Hey everybody, welcome to another off-the-shelf board game review. This week we're going to be looking at Roll Through the Ages, the Iron Age, which is a spiritual successor to Roll Through the Ages, the Bronze Age. It's basically a dice-based civilization game for 1 to 4 players, ages 10 and up. Average playtime is going to be anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. Unless, of course, you get the Mediterranean expansion and throw it in there. And this is actually a really nice expansion. I'm going to do a separate review for it. It does add a little bit to the playtime, but trust me when I say that once you get this expansion, you won't play the game without it probably ever again. In Roll Through the Ages, the Iron Age, each player is going to be a civilization that they're going to track with one of these scoreboards, which tracks your resources, your military, and other things that you may have, and also a score sheet, which allows you to track things such as your technologies, your great wonders, cities, conquests, and finally disasters. On a player's turn, each player is going to roll a certain amount of dice based on the size of their civilization, plus a fate die, which is given them random special things such as the ability to go on conquest, the ability to demand tribute from your opponents, or finally just to suffer the winds of fate and suffer disasters. Players will need to develop technologies, track their food that they'll need to feed their cities, have goods that are going to use to help improve their civilization and make it grow, have wars against each other, have wars against barbarians, have random attacks from other civilizations, pretty much consider them NPC civilizations out there to make your life more difficult. And if you get the right technology, you can even have your own navy, which is going to help your military strength. The player who can most efficiently manage their civilization as it grows, keep the resources they need, grow their city at the right pace without growing it too fast or they're going to suffer famine, and score the most victory points will be the winner of Roll Through the Ages, the Iron Age. Before I show you how to play Roll Through the Ages, there's a couple core concepts you need to understand, and the rest of the game will make a heck of a lot more sense. The first thing to understand is the pegboard, which each player is going to get that they're going to use to track their resources that their nation currently has. And the tracks are going to be for your food resources, which is the green track. You have your goods resource, which is the gray track. The cross swords over the shield, or the cross spears, is your current military level. The next one is the ships represent how many ships you currently have in your empire. And then finally, this top peg tracks how much money or finances your nation currently has. And each one of these spaces represents 5 gold, or whatever you want to say, 5 money, however you want to refer to it. And this money is going to be used to research developments for your budding, growing empire. And since each one of these spaces represents 5, you don't actually get change back. So if you want to buy a development for your empire that costs 13 gold, you'd have to spend at least 3 of these little gold markers to do it, because remember, every one of these little spaces represents exactly 5 gold, so you'd spend 3, which would be worth 15 gold, and you don't get any change back. So it does behoove you to start using goods to help you pay for your developments, and it also forces you to be smart about which kind of developments you're buying and exactly when you're buying those developments. At the start of every single player's turn, they're going to roll a certain amount of dice, which are these brown dice right here, plus the fate die, depending on exactly how large their empire is. So the size 3 empire is going to roll 3 dice plus the fate die, or the largest size, which is a size 6 empire, will roll all 6 of these wood-colored dice plus the fate die. Every time you start your turn, you roll the fate die plus exactly how many of these dice based on the size of your empire. The larger your empire is, the more dice you're going to roll, but of course that also means the more resources your empire is going to consume, so you need to make sure you're balancing growth with income of things such as food, which is something you need to feed your empire. The empire dice for your growing, budding empire are the exact same 6 dice. These 6 dice have the exact same sides, so there's no difference between these dice. The only die that is different is the fate die, and it's going to modify exactly what's happening with the roll of every one of these dice. Now the fate die has 6 sides. Some of the sides are good, some of these sides are bad, and you just kind of have to suffer the whims of fate. Luckily, this game does give you multiple re-rolls, so it's not too terrible, but I'll go ahead and explain exactly what the fate die can do for you every time you roll it. The fate die can bring you abundance, which means you're going to score some extra food when you roll for your resources at the start of your turn. The fate die can also bring you a drought, which means you're going to suffer less resources and get less food at the start of every one of your, or the start of that current turn. The next thing you can do is you can have a conquest from the fate die. Now what a conquest will allow you to do is it's going to allow you to attack pretty much NPC nations. You can't use conquest to attack other players, but you can use the tribute side, which allows you to actually directly interact with other players and force them to give your mighty, growing empire some tribute. The whims of fate can also provide you some positive omens, which is going to allow you to change the face of any die of the dice you've rolled. Or finally, the opposite of good omens is disaster, which can strike your mighty growing empire. Your empire dice, now remember again, you get one empire die depending on the size of your current empire. The larger your empire is, the more these dice you're going to get to roll. But your empire die can give you an innovation. Innovations are used for development. It can allow you to earn goods from, depending on how many ports you currently own. It can give you food, which will help you feed your nation as your nation continues to grow. It can give you workers. Workers will help you build larger cities, larger ports, and also help you start working on some of the great wonders, which will help give your civilization more culture and possibly protect your culture and your growing empire from barbarian invasion. You can also get the randomizer die. While it doesn't give you as many workers or food as these two dice may, it does give you the decision to choose between 2 workers or 2 food, where these dice give you 3 workers or 3 food. You decide exactly which one of those resources you happen to need more. Or finally, the whims of fate can bring disaster upon your empire. And the terrible thing about disasters are the more these skull and crossbones you roll, the more disastrous it can be to you, to your fellow players, or on a grand scale to everybody as the game goes on. Each player is also going to get a score sheet that's going to track their growing empire, and it's going to be basically showing how many dice they get to roll on their turn. It's going to show how many ports they have, and the more ports they have, the more goods their empire produces when they roll goods on the goods dice. It's also going to track their provinces, which is going to give them more military, and also give them extra tribute, which is going to be worth extra victory points at the end of the game. Now, to build more ports or to build more provinces, you need to spend goods when it comes to ports, and you also need to have workers do your work for you to help build those ports. If you just want to add provinces to your empire, the only thing it takes is you got to have more workers and send them to work to build those extra provinces. Workers are also used to help you build more monuments, which are going to be worth more victory points at the end of the game, and some of them are going to give you special benefits, such as the Great Walls, which will keep the barbarians out from your growing empire. Innovations are going to help you build developments along with spending money, and also spending goods are going to help you start building these innovations and these developments, which are going to improve your empire. Having a large army is going to help you gain conquest, help you gain tribute, and finally, having these skulls is going to give you disasters, which are going to help possibly your opponents, or possibly hinder you, or possibly just hurt everybody in the game, and also force some people to start losing victory points at the end of the game. Now that you understand the basics of how to play Roll Through the Ages, I can show you exactly how a full turn goes out. Each turn is going to be played out through a couple different phases, and each player in turn is going to go through all the phases. Then they're going to pass the dice on to the next player, who's going to do the exact same thing. And you're basically going to keep doing this until a certain victory condition has been met. And once that victory condition has been met, players are going to add up their scores. Whoever has the most victory points is going to be the grand winner. There's a short and a long version. If you want the long version of the game, it's going to require a certain amount of extra resources to be available to all the players, and that's going to bring out the end of the game. Or if you want the shorter version of the game, it's going to be a less amount of resources available out, and once those are out, that's going to bring around the end game. And if you ever forget what the end game conditions are, they're listed on every single player's score sheet right down here. It tells you exactly what you need to bring about the end game. And once that condition has been met, if that player is not the last player for that round, every remaining player still gets to finish off their turn, meaning that every single player in Roll Through the Ages gets an equal amount of turns. Nobody ends up with more turns for having to bring around the end game before anybody else. At the start of every single game of Roll Through the Ages, each player is going to get a certain amount of resources, and each player needs to make a specific decision on how they want their empire to start growing. If you ever forget what the starting resources are, they're all marked on the little pegboard here. The number is going to be circled, so you get 3 food to start off, you get 1 good to start off. Your army starts at 1, you start with 0 shipping, and you start with 0 money in your reserves for your empire. The next thing you need to do is you may need to make a decision. Do you want to start with 1 extra port, which means you're going to start the game with 2 ports? Or do you want to start the game with 1 extra province, which means you'll start the game with 2 provinces? Now, the difference between those is if you have extra ports, when you happen to roll the goods die and you get a goods result, you're going to get a good for every single port you own. So if you happen to have 4 ports and you roll this on the die, you're going to gain 4 goods added to your empire. If you only happen to have 1 port in your empire and you roll this, your empire is only going to produce 1 good. So ports are pretty valuable and pretty darn important, so it can be a very important decision. But if you start with 2 provinces, your empire is going to start with an extra 2 to the military And you're also going to start off with some tribute, which is going to go towards your extra victory points towards the end game and possibly bring you victory. And if you ever forget, those really nice reminders on each one of these score sheets. You see that the first province is going to give you +2 to your army, +1 tribute. Third province is going to give you +2 armies, +2 to your tribute. And finally, this is all cumulative, and if you get finally to the final province, you see it's going to give you +2 armies, and it's also going to give you +5 to your tribute. Once you've made your decision on how you want to start your empire, you're just going to go ahead and circle to signify exactly which decision you decided to make. And then you just need to fill in the square, and if, in this case, you have to fill in the urns to let you know that you've already spent the resources to produce that port. And now at the start of the game, this player in this example starts with 2 ports and 1 province. And remember, you get a certain amount of dice based on the size of your empire. You're going to figure out that whichever is the more you have. If you have more ports than provinces, you're going to get 1 die for every port you have. If you have more provinces than you have ports, again, you're going to get 1 die for every port or province you have. So since we're starting with 2 ports, we're going to start with 2 dice for empire, and we're also going to start with the fate die because the player always rolls the fate die every time they roll the dice, their empire dice for their empire. This also means we're not going to get a 3rd empire die to roll until we build our 3rd port or until we build our 3rd province, whichever happens first. So technically, if you wanted to, you can just build 6 ports and never build another single province, and you would end up at the end of the game, or by the time you got to that point, you'd end up with 6 empire dice to roll. Or if in this example, I never built a single port after this and I just kept building provinces, once I built my 3rd province, I would have 3 dice. Once I built my 4th province, even though I only have 2 ports, I would have 4 dice. And once I built my 6th province, of course, I'm going to have 6 dice, even though I've only built 2 ports. It's the most of your provinces or the most of your ports decides how many empire dice you're going to roll on every single start of your turn. Once each player made the decision how they're going to start their empire, the starting player is going to mark themselves as a starting player on their empire board. And again, that makes sure that this player doesn't get extra turns by people forgetting who the start player was. Because remember, the game is going to end as soon as one of these end game conditions are met. And every single remaining player on that turn is going to finish up their turns. And it's not going to go back up to the start player again. That is going to be the final turn for the entire game. The start player is then going to roll an amount of dice based on how many ports or provinces they had plus the fate die, and they're going to look at the results that they got on their die roll. They can either decide to keep any or all those dice, or they can decide to roll any or all these dice up to 3 times. And you can keep rolling these dice again up to 3 times as long as you don't roll a skull on the die. If you happen to roll a skull on the die, that die is permanently locked. You can't roll it anymore, and you're just going to continue rolling the rest of your dice again until you've made 3 rerolls, or you decide to stop rolling, or some of the dice come up with skull results, and then you're done rolling. If you ever played King of Tokyo or Yahtzee, you're pretty familiar with the mechanic, except in this case, you can't re-roll anything with a skull. That's the only thing that stops you from continuing to roll up to 3 times. Once you're finished with your rolling, you're going to go ahead and gain resources depending on what you rolled on the dice. Now, even though these skulls are pretty terrible for you, they're going to cause disasters, luckily they do give you some resources. You're going to get 1 good for the good symbol on the skull die. So since I have 2 skulls, I'm going to gain 2 goods. So I'm going to go from 1 to 3 goods. And then on this die, I need to make a decision. Do I want to gain 2 food to add to my stores, which I really don't need at the beginning of the game, because I'm only going to need to feed 1 of my provinces since I only own 1 province. Or I can save this die for the worker phase where I put my workers to work to help me build wonders, help me possibly build onto my empire, or possibly help me do other things. If I decide to take the food, I'm simply going to add the food to my pegboard and add that to my empire. But in this case, I'm not going to take the food, so I can show you exactly what happens next. After you're done accepting the resources you gain from your empire, you have to feed your empire based on how many provinces you own. Now, it's very important to understand is how many provinces you own, not ports. So if you happen to own 6 ports and 1 province, it's only going to cost you 1 food to feed your empire. If you happen to have 1 port and 6 provinces, it's going to cost you 6 food. It's going to cost you 1 food for every province your empire currently has. So since we only have 1 province at the start of the game, since we decided to take the extra port, we have to spend 1 food, so we're going to go down from 3 down to 2 food left in our stock reserves. After we feed our empire, we need to resolve any skulls that we roll. Now, if we don't roll any skulls, we don't need to worry about it, but in this case, we happen to roll 2 skulls on our empire. And the negative results, or possibly positive results, are going to be based on exactly how many skulls you happen to roll. If you only roll 1 skull, you're going to suffer 1 disaster, which is going to be worth 1 negative victory point at the end of the game. You just simply fill in the little skull to show that you have 1 -1 victory point towards the end game victory conditions. If you happen to roll 2 skulls, some barbarians are going to attack your civilization. If you happen to roll 3 skulls, that means famine is going to strike. But the nice thing about famine is it actually doesn't attack, or I'm sorry, not famine, it's pestilence. Unlike some of the other negative disasters, pestilence actually only affects all your opponents. So if you happen to get 3 skulls and you happen to be playing a 4-player game, every empire except your own is going to suffer the effects of pestilence. And since pestilence is a disaster, that means every opponent is going to fill in 3 skulls on their score sheet, which is going to be worth -3 points at the end of the game. Now, if you happen to be playing the solo game, that means pestilence is going to affect you and you alone. But again, in a multiplayer game, pestilence does not affect the person who rolled the 3 skulls. It affects every other player. It only affects you if you're playing the solo rules. If you happen to roll 4 skulls on your turn, that means civil war is going to break out in your empire, which is going to be a disaster worth 4 skulls filled in on your score sheet, which is going to be worth -4 victory points at the end of the game. And if you have the misfortune of happening to roll 5 skulls or possibly even 6 skulls, or I guess it could be possible to roll 7 skulls, then the final thing that's going to happen is every single player in the game, which means just you in the solo game or all 4 of the players, if it happens to be a 4-player game, are going to be invaded and they're going to have to fight off some invaders. Invasions and barbarian attacks are going to happen in the 3rd phase of the game, or the 3rd phase of your round, which happens to be the same time that conquests and also tributes will happen. Now remember, conquests and tributes will happen through the fate die. If you happen to roll a conquest, that means you may go on a conquest and conquest non-player empires, or if you happen to roll the tribute die, you can force all the other players to either pay you tribute or to give you a good to prevent you from gaining tribute. Of course, this does mean if you don't roll for the tribute, or you don't happen to get the conquest on the die, or if there's no barbarians or no invasion, then there's not going to be any battles on your turn. But since we happen to have 2 skulls on our turn, we know there's going to be a barbarian attack, so we're going to have to go ahead and resolve that. If your empire is attacked by a barbarian, or if your empire happens to be invaded, what you need to do is you need to compare the current military strength of your empire, which is your current military, possibly plus any innovations that you managed to develop during your empire's lifetime, such as the ability to have a navy, which can make your military stronger, or possibly learning tactics, which is also going to add to the total strength of your military and your armies. Then you're simply going to compare the strength of your empire to the strength of whatever enemy you may be fighting, whether it's barbarians, whether it happens to be invaders, or whether it happens to be your army going out and conquesting other neighboring tribes. Now, since our starting empire right here happens to have an army level of 1, we don't have any innovations, we haven't developed the ability to even have a navy yet, that means our total military strength happens to be 1. We're going to compare that to the 4 strength of the barbarians. They're stronger than us, so we're going to suffer 3 total disasters because it's 4 minus 1 happens to be 3. So we're going to suffer some more disasters, which is going to be worth some minus victory points at the end of the game. Now, of course, if this happened to the yellow player and they happen to have a problem with some barbarians, they're actually going to relish an attack from the barbarians because their empire is so strong. They're going to compare their current military plus their current navy, because we're going to pretend in this example the yellow player happens to have a navy development. They're going to add this together, which is 7 plus 5, which is a total of 12. They're going to subtract from that the total strength of barbarians of 4, which is going to be 8, which means they're going to gain 8 positive victory points for developing enough military to destroy an opponent, and that's going to be marked as tribute points on their scoreboard. And they would simply go ahead and gain 8 tribute, which can be 8 victory points at the end of the game. So if you have a good military, sometimes barbarians or invasions can be a good thing. If you don't keep track of your military, barbarians and invasions are definitely going to be a negative for your growing empire. Win, lose, or draw, though, fighting wars, fighting battles can be draining on your army, can be draining on your empire, and it's represented in Roll Through the Ages by the fact that every time you go through a battle, now this is a battle versus barbarians or a conquest or versus invaders, this doesn't actually count for doing tribute. Tribute's done a little bit differently, but anytime you do a conquest or you fight barbarians or you have to deal with invaders, you're going to lose 1 from your army permanently until you manage to build it back up. And if you happen to have a navy on top of that, you're also going to lose 1 from your army and 1 from your navy, which is a permanent loss due to attrition, due to how difficult wars can be to fight. If you happen to roll a conquest on the fate die and decide that you want to do a little bit of conquest, what you're going to do for a conquest is you're basically going to attack a neighboring tribe. And again, that's not another player. Conquests are basically versus a hate to use the term, basically an imaginary or an NPC type of player. And the way it's basically going to work is you're going to compare your total military strength, and of course that's going to include all your developments, your current army, and if you develop navies, it's also going to include that. You're going to compare that to your last conquest, and that's going to be how many tribute you're going to gain. So in this example, we have a total of 6 army, plus we have 4, because we have in this example a navy, that's going to be a total of 10. We haven't done any conquests yet, so we're going to take the number 1, which is how many conquests it starts for the basic conquest level. We're going to subtract that from our current army, and we're going to gain that difference in tribute. So in this example, we gain 9 points of tribute, which is going to be worth 9 victory points at the end of the game. And once that's done, further conquests are going to get a little bit tougher, and to represent that, we fill in the next box on the conquest. That does mean that we need at least 2 points of conquest next to see if we can conquer. And after that, it's going to go up to 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The conquests are going to continue to grow, forcing us to have larger and larger armies before we can go out on these conquests. And of course, conquests, just like barbarians and just like invasions, they're very tough on an army to keep them going, so you're going to suffer a little bit of losses and a little bit of attrition to your empire. But don't worry, if you have enough other resources, you can always buy up your army and buy up your navy all over again. The next thing you can do in the battle phase, of course, is the tribute. And what tribute does is what you're going to do is all the other players have to pay tribute to your mighty empire based on your military strength compared to your opponent's military strength. What you're going to do is you add up all your military strength and you compare it to the other players in order, and however much higher your military strength is compared to their military strength is going to be worth tribute to you. So in this example, the yellow player currently has a total military strength of 8. Let's say they don't have any developments they're going to add on to it. They're going to compare it to the purple player, who currently has a 1 army, so they're going to have 8 minus 1, they're going to gain 7 tribute. Let's say the green player currently has a 7 army, and the gray player currently has a 4 army right now. So they're going to compare their 8 strength to the green player's 7, which means they're going to gain an additional point of tribute. And then they're going to compare their 8 to the gray player's 4, which give them an additional 4 points of tribute. So they gain 7, 1, and 4 total tribute from all the players on that turn. But there's one exception to this rule. If one player decides that they don't want another player to gain a lot of tribute points, which are going to be worth a lot of victory points at the end of the game, they can actually sacrifice one of their goods by giving it to that player, and this will actually be a transfer of goods versus the tribute, which is just victory points. Nothing's actually transferred. The tributing player just gains those victory points. What you can do is you can sacrifice a good, which means this player is not going to get any tribute from this player. They just get the one sacrifice good that goes to their empire board. So in this example, the purple player decided they just want to give one good to the yellow player. This yellow player will not get any tribute from this player. They just gain the one good. They'd get the 1 tribute from green, and then they get the 4 tribute from the gray player. After battles have been resolved, players can start spending their resources to start building up their empire and improving their empire standings throughout the game. What you're going to do is you're simply going to look at your development sheet for your empire, and any people you happen to have to spend as resources can be used to fill in the squares on the board. Any urns on the symbols on your empire board can be spent to improve those resources. But you have to be careful because the urns or the goods can also be used for developments during the 5th phase of your turn, so you have to balance whether you want to use them to help you build ports or if you want to save them for spending on developments. So in our example, we happen to have this player here who has 2 workers plus 1 worker plus 1 worker. Now remember, even though these dice gave us skulls, they also gave us goods, and they also give us workers, so we have a total of 4 workers. So we can fill in up to 4 squares anywhere on our empire board, and that could possibly even help us build other things that may actually give us more dice on following rounds. So in this example, we happen to have 3 urns or goods for our empire, and we also happen to have 4 workers that we can put to work. We could, if we wanted to, fill in 1 worker, a 2nd worker, a 3rd worker, a 4th worker, and now we actually have 3 dice that are going to be available to our empire on the following turn. And not only that, we're going to gain 2 to our army plus 1 tribute, plus another 2, plus another 2 tribute for a total gain of 4 to our military. Unfortunately, we can't go past 7, so it's kind of a waste for this player. And then we'd also gain 3 tribute for our empire because we just raised our province strength. Alternately, I could have sent those workers out here to help build the ports, and I could have spent some of these goods to help build our ports, which could have been basically the same thing by giving us an extra empire die on the following round. Or I could have used these workers to start working on these monuments, and once these monuments are built by filling in all the squares by sending these workers out there, we're going to get victory points, and possibly if you build the wall, we're going to be protected from barbarians. Now, a nice thing about these monuments is if you're the first player to build that monument, you get the amount of victory points in the circle. Every other player, only if they build that monument on their turn, they can only get the secondary or the smaller score point. So there is a little bit of a race to make sure you're the first person to build a monument, because it's going to be worth the most amount of victory points for whoever builds it first. All the other players are stuck with the lower amount of victory points for building that monument. Instead of spending your workers out here to help build your provinces, your ports, and also your monuments, you can also use a worker plus 1 food to help increase the size of your army, but there is a max amount of size you can have for your army. Also, if you've managed to create the development that allows you to build ships, you can also spend 2 goods, which is going to allow you to build 1 ship and add that 1 ship to your empire. After you're done building up your empire, the next thing you get to do is you get to pick 1 development and 1 development only, assuming you can afford it, and you get to add that development to your empire, which is permanently going to give you an extra special ability depending on what the development is. Now, each one of the developments has a cost listed on the left-hand side. They have a certain amount of victory points they're going to give you towards the end of the game. And finally, they're going to give you a special ability, which is a permanent ability for your empire. Now, you can buy these innovations or these developments by spending innovations. Now, one of these innovations is worth 3 points towards the development, unless you get the development that's going to turn this face of the die into a 5. Again, that's kind of one of the things these developments can do. You can also start spending your gold. Remember, each one of these sections of gold is worth 5 points on developments. So if we currently happen to have 3 gold, that'd actually be 15 points when we spend on developments. Or finally, we can also spend our goods at a 1-for-1 to help us get these developments. The important rule to remember here is that you're only allowed to buy 1 development on your turn per turn, and you can't get any change back when you're buying that development. So for example, if we happen to have 3 of these innovation sides and we want to buy a development that happen to cost 8 points to build, such as the aqueducts, we see it costs 8, and it's going to give us a special benefit for the rest of the game. If we spend these 3 innovation dice, which will be worth a total of 9 development points, we want to get change back for the 1 remaining development point. What we could do is, if we want to be smart about our resources, we could spend 1 innovation plus 1 of our monies, which would give us a total of 8, which would be just enough to buy the aqueducts, and that would give us, without any wasted resources on that aspect. The only problem you have to be careful with is that innovation not used on your turn is innovation that's wasted. So you're better off spending these innovations or choosing a more expensive development to build for your empire. After you're done buying your development, if you choose to do that for your empire, you're free to spend goods to turn these goods into money for your empire, because each one of these tracts is a maximum. And if you start getting a large empire size and you start getting a lot of these goods rolled and you have a lot of ports built, you can actually start getting wasted resources. So what you can do is you turn your goods in. For every 4 goods that you spend at the end of your turn, you can gain 1 gold. And remember, these gold can be used to buy developments. That's a full round. After you've done that, you're simply going to pass the dice on to the next player, who's going to do the exact same thing. Roll the dice based on how big their empire is. Spend their dice, spend their resources. You're going to keep doing that until one of the end game victory conditions have been met. That's going to be the final round of the game. Everybody's going to add up all their scores based on how big their empire is, what developments they've had, what tribute they have, what disasters have affected their empire. Whoever has the most victory points at the end of the game is going to be the winner. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video explaining how to play Roll Through the Ages, the Iron Age. You can go ahead and set everything up and start video number 2, where I'm going to show you some sample gameplay.